The Texas plains stretched wide beneath a pale, unforgiving moon, its light spilling silver across the tall grass and jagged rocks. The night should have been peaceful, but the silence was broken by cruel laughter and the clink of iron. A young Comanche girl lay bound across the cold steel of unfinished railroad tracks, her wrists tied with rope so tight it cut her skin raw. The drunken men who had captured her treated the moment like sport, raising bottles of whiskey and jeering at her cries. Every sound seemed to echo across the wide-open land, the rustle of chains, the harsh whistle of wind through the grass, and the faint thrum of rails waiting to carry death closer. She pressed her cheek against the iron, cold biting into her skin, and tried to summon courage from the ancestors she prayed still watched over her. But fear strangled her chest, leaving her heart pounding faster than the faint hum she thought. She could already hear. She'd been strong until now. When they dragged her from her people's camp, she did not weep. When they jeered at her dress and mocked her language, she held her chin high. But tied to the rails, stripped of dignity and power, even her pride began to bend beneath the weight of terror. Her dark eyes searched the horizon, desperate for any sign of salvation. The men around her were careless, some passed out from drink, others tossing dice as though a young woman's life were nothing more than a game. They laughed at her trembling lips, at the way her breath caught, calling her wild and worthless. To them, she was no more than an object of ridicule, bound and helpless. She bit her lip until it bled, unwilling to let them see her. In cry, though hot tears burned behind her lashes, somewhere far off, the faint whistle of a train split the stillness, low and long, promising that her last moments would not be slow but fast and merciless. The iron rails beneath her cheek vibrated, faintly, a warning more chilling than the jeers of her captors. The ground trembled just enough to make her heartbeat falter. She thought of her family, her tribe, the firelight dances she would never see again. She thought of the songs her mother sang when the nights grew long and cold, songs that spoke of spirits watching over the brave. But she no longer felt brave. She felt like a child about to be swallowed by the world's cruelty. Closing her eyes, she whispered words into the wind in her native tongue, words only the stars might hear, a plea not for life, but for dignity in death. Her captors shouted louder, raising their arms toward the sky as if celebrating the approach of her end. The train's whistle grew sharper, closer now, its iron heart pounding against the earth. Then, out of the darkness, another sound broke through, the thunder of hooves pounding against the hard-packed dirt. At first, she thought it was her imagination, some last fragment of hope her mind conjured to comfort her. But the men heard it too. They staggered to their feet, shouting, squinting into the distance. A lone figure emerged against the horizon, framed by moonlight, a cowboy astride a stallion, galloping like a shadow carved from the night. His hat brim hung low over his eyes, his coat whipping in the wind. In his hand, steel flashed, the barrel of a revolver that caught the moon's glow. He did not slow. The horse's stride lengthened, dirt spraying behind it, as man and beast became a streak of speed across the plains. The captors laughed at first, waving bottles, convinced he would turn back. But when the first bullet cracked into the air, shattering a whiskey jug beside them, their laughter died in their throats. The cowboy didn't shout threats or warnings. His actions spoke louder. Gunfire sparked in the night as he rode hard, each shot deliberate, each aimed to scatter the drunken mob. The stallion's mane streamed like fire against the moonlight, hooves striking sparks on the stones. Some of the men scrambled for their weapons, but drunken hands fumbled in panic. Others staggered into the dark, too afraid to face the fury bearing down on them. The girl's heart leapt painfully in her chest. Was this real, or some vision before? Death. He came closer. Closer still, until she could see the determination etched in his face. Not anger, not drunken rage like the others, but resolve. The cowboy's jaw was set hard, his eyes fixed not on the men, but on her. It was as though he had ridden through the night for this single moment, for her alone. She pulled against her ropes, desperate to rise, but the bonds bit deeper into her skin. The rails rattled louder, trembling now with the promise of iron wheels. The roar of the train echoed across the plains, a beast of steel and smoke that devoured everything in its path. Her chest constricted, torn between terror and the wild. Flicker of hope the rider brought. He raised his pistol again, firing into the air. The mob broke fully this time, scattering into the grass like startled coyotes. Only a few held their ground, and even they hesitated, knowing they could not match the speed of a charging stallion. The cowboy urged his horse forward, leaning low as if fusing with the animal's strength. Dust and moonlight swirled around him as he bore down on the tracks. When he was nearly upon her, the stallion reared, hooves flashing high against the starlit sky. The cowboy swung from the saddle with practiced grace, landing beside her in a crouch. His pistol barked one last time, sending the final two tormentors fleeing into the shadows. Then silence fell, broken only by the thunder of the train closing in. Without hesitation, he dropped to one knee, drawing a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed as it cut into the ropes, fibers snapping one by one. Her breath came fast, half choked by fear, half by disbelief. She felt the chains loosen, her arms free, the sting of rope burns against her skin. The cowboy's hand caught her shoulder, steady and sure, pulling her upright just as the rails shuddered violently. The girl stumbled into his chest, her body trembling as the ground began to quake beneath the approaching monster. His coat smelled of leather and dust, his grip strong but not cruel. She dared to lift her gaze, and in the shadow beneath his hat, she saw his eyes for the first time. They were not cold, not mocking, not filled with greed like the others, only fierce determination. The kind of fire that burned without cruelty. His voice came low and rough, words meant only for her. Hold on. And before she could even draw a full breath, he lifted her into his arms, turning back toward the stallion that pawed the earth, ready to flee. The rails roared beneath them, vibrating with the fury of a train that bore down fast, its whistle shrieking into the night. The cowboy moved with a swiftness born of survival, his boots kicking against the dirt as he vaulted onto the saddle with her pressed tightly against him. The stallion lunged forward, muscles coiled, and unleashed like thunder. Behind them, the tracks shook as steel wheels screamed past, a rush of smoke and fire devouring the place where she had lain moments before. The wind tore at her hair, her chest heaved against the cowboy's steady frame, and she could not tell whether the pounding in her ears was the train or her own heart. The thunder of the train still echoed in the distance, a fading roar swallowed by the night, but its fury lingered in the tremble of the earth beneath them. Dust swirled in the stallion's wake, the acrid smoke of gunpowder hanging in the cool air. The cowboy still held the girl close, her body pressed against the leather of his coat, her breath ragged and uneven. For a long moment, neither spoke, as though words might shatter the fragile miracle that they had survived. She gripped the folds of his shirt with trembling fingers, and he steadied her, his palm warm and firm against her back. The moon cast its pale light over them, painting their shadows long across the empty plains, two silhouettes bound together by chance and destiny. Slowly, her legs steadied beneath her, though she still leaned into him, as if afraid the world might shift again and steal her balance. Her voice, when it came, was soft and hesitant, trembling with the memory of what she had faced. "I thought—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I thought I would die there." Her words carried the weight of terror, but also the fragile spark of gratitude. The cowboy looked down at her, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, and shook his head. "Not tonight," he said simply, his tone low and sure, as if fate itself had no choice but to obey him. She searched his face, and in his silence, she felt something stronger than promises, an unspoken vow, The stallion snorted nearby, pawing at the earth as if restless to continue, and the cowboy guided her gently toward the animal. She hesitated, her gaze flicking back toward the tracks, where chains and broken ropes still glistened in the moonlight. The memory of her captors lingered, and a shiver ran through her frame. He noticed, his hand tightening on her shoulder. "They won't come back," he assured her, though his voice carried the edge of steel, a promise that if they dared, he would face them again. She nodded, trusting him, though she barely knew him, because trust was all she had left in that a moment. He lifted her into the saddle before swinging up behind her, his arms strong around her waist. With a sharp whistle, the stallion surged forward, carrying them away from the scene of horror into the deep night. The ride was long, the land stretching endless and silent around them, but the rhythm of the stallion's gallop steadied her heartbeat. Pressed against him, she could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of life and strength that reminded her she was no longer alone. She tilted her head back, watching the stars wheel overhead, and whispered a silent prayer of thanks to the spirits of her people. The cowboy said nothing, but his grip remained firm, guiding her through the dark plains with the certainty of a man who had faced death before and survived it. Each mile they put between themselves and the tracks loosened the knot of fear in her chest, and for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to breathe without dread. At dawn, the horizon bloomed with streaks of pink and gold, and the stallion slowed to a trot. The cowboy guided the horse toward a small grove by a creek, where cottonwoods swayed in the morning breeze. He dismounted first, then helped her down, his touch careful, as though she might break. She sank to her knees by the water, cupping it in her hands, washing the dirt and tears from her face. He stood nearby, silent, giving her space, his figure outlined by the rising sun. When she turned back to him, her eyes still glistened, but there was strength returning there. "Why did you save me?" she asked quietly, the question trembling between them. He adjusted his hat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because no one else would," he answered, his voice rough but honest. Her lips parted, surprise flickering across her face, followed by something deeper, understanding. He hadn't come for reward or recognition. He had come because it was right. That truth settled into her heart like a seed planted in rich soil, and she felt gratitude swell inside her, too large for words. Rising to her feet, she stepped closer to him, her voice steadier this time. "You risked your life for mine. That is something I will never forget." His eyes met hers then, the silence between them heavy with meaning. He didn't answer with words, but in the quiet strength of his gaze, she saw the vow he hadn't spoken. He would not abandon her. The days that followed were a blur of movement and healing. He brought her to his cabin, a modest home on the edge of the plains, where the land rolled wide and open, dotted with cattle and wildflowers. There he gave her safety, food, and rest. At first she spoke little, carrying the weight of trauma and the memories of her people. But as time passed, she began to laugh softly at his quiet jokes, to hum songs by the fire, to teach him words in her native tongue. The walls of silence between them began to crack, replaced by trust that grew day by day. He never pressed her for promises or bargains. She came to realize that his rescue had not been an exchange, but a gift freely given. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson over the horizon, she stood beside him at the fence line. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The stallion pawed the earth nearby, and the air smelled of sage and dust. She turned to him, her dark hair catching the last light, her voice steady. "You said I don't owe you anything," she murmured. He nodded, his expression guarded, as though bracing himself for her to walk away. But she stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm. "But I choose to stay," she whispered, Not as a captive, not as a debt, as your wife. His breath caught, the weight of her words sinking deeper than any bullet or battle ever had. He searched her face for hesitation, for doubt, but found only certainty. Slowly he removed his hat, his rough hands trembling slightly as he took hers. "Then it will be your choice," he said, voice husky. "Always your choice." Under the twilight sky, they stood together, two souls, scarred by loss, but bound now by something stronger than chains, stronger than fear, love born in the fire of danger, tested against death itself. That night, the cowboy knew he had not just rescued her from the rails. He had found something greater, hope he thought he had lost, and a partner to walk beside him on the unforgiving frontier. And for the Comanche girl who had once whispered a desperate plea into the night, there was no more fear in her voice, only strength. Beneath the endless Texas sky, their lives were forever entwined.